So as we look toward the next 250 years, we must also reflect on our shared responsibility to safeguard nature, our most precious and irreplaceable asset.
Royal family shocked as Lady Louise's lawyers confirm she inherits what Charles denied her for years. Okay, stay with this for a moment, because that title points to a dispute that allegedly began with one overlooked estate clause and ended with Lady Louise Windsor's lawyers confronting a much bigger question. Who had the right to decide what Prince Philip intended to leave behind? According to the story being examined here, Louise was allegedly denied recognition of a private inheritance for years, until her lawyers uncovered documentation that appeared to say something very different, and this was not simply about money. The disputed inheritance allegedly included Prince Philip's treasured carriage collection and a private fund he had intended for Louise. What made the case different was the claim that the paperwork had not disappeared, been destroyed, or forgotten completely. It was allegedly sitting inside confidential family records, waiting for someone to notice one sentence that could change the entire argument. The moment that sentence was brought forward, the story stopped being a quiet family inheritance question. It became a confrontation over Philip's final wishes, Charles's authority, and the possibility that someone within the royal circle had known about the arrangement long before Louise's lawyers ever put it on the table. And according to the accounts surrounding this case, Princess Anne was the person who first noticed that something in the records did not add up. Hi viewers, if you believe Lady Louise should be allowed to receive what Prince Philip intended for her, would you stand with her by leaving a simple yes in the comments? That question matters because this story is not built around a glamorous palace announcement or a public ceremony.
Following in the naval footsteps of my father, Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, my grandfather, King George VI, my great-uncle, Lord Mountbatten, and my great-grandfather, King George V. This year, of course, also marks the 25th anniversary of 9/11. This atrocity was a defining moment for America.
It begins in a much quieter place, with documents that allegedly changed the meaning of an inheritance. There was no dramatic warning beforehand, no public accusation, no announcement from Buckingham Palace. Instead, there was a file, a clause, and a name that should have been impossible to overlook. And when that file was examined more closely, the first problem appeared. The language did not read like a casual gift. It allegedly described specific property and financial provisions connected to Philip's private estate, with Louise identified as the intended beneficiary. That distinction is crucial. A casual gift can be interpreted, transferred, or handled differently depending on the circumstances surrounding it. A formal estate instruction is another matter entirely. The story claims that Louise's lawyers were not relying on family memories or private conversations. They were examining documentary evidence. That meant every word mattered, every date mattered, every signature mattered. Even the way the assets had been recorded after Philip's death could become important. And that is where the atmosphere around the case allegedly changed. Because if the documents were genuine and their interpretation was correct, the question was no longer whether Louise deserved the inheritance. The question became whether an earlier decision had already given her a legal claim that later palace arrangements could not simply erase. That possibility would have been uncomfortable enough. But then came the carriage collection. For Philip, carriages were not simply decorative objects sitting behind palace doors. They were connected to one of his enduring interests, and to a part of his identity that existed outside the ceremonial machinery of the crown. He was known for his interest in carriage driving, and that personal connection gives the alleged inheritance a meaning that goes beyond financial value. The collection represented something personal. That is precisely why the claims surrounding Louise became so sensitive. According to the account being examined, Philip had allegedly intended Louise to have exclusive ownership of the collection, rather than merely temporary access to it. Alongside that, a private inheritance fund was allegedly established as part of the same broader arrangement. But there was a problem.
First of all, he'd take me on a different route every day, and I do not know how he managed to do that. But he would also tell me all sorts of anecdotes about absolutely anything and everything. He's honestly one of the most interesting people I've ever met.
The arrangement was not being treated as though it existed. For years, the story claims, Louise had not been publicly recognized as having exclusive control over those assets. That is where the allegation of denial enters the narrative. The claim is not that Louise suddenly discovered a fortune hidden behind a wall. It is that the paperwork allegedly indicated something had already been decided, yet that decision had not produced the outcome Philip apparently intended. And once lawyers began following that trail, they reportedly found another layer. The original estate documentation contained a clause that appeared to restrict later interference. That single detail changed the stakes, because if Philip had deliberately written protections around the inheritance, then any later attempt to alter the arrangement would have required more than simply asserting royal authority. It would have required confronting the exact terms Philip allegedly left behind. And that is where King Charles enters the story. The account surrounding the dispute portrays Charles as operating within a broader system of royal administration in which family assets, residences, titles, and financial arrangements could be reviewed as the monarchy changed. Modernization, cost control, and restructuring could all provide reasons for examining old arrangements. But private inheritance creates a different problem. A monarch may have enormous institutional authority, but that does not automatically mean every private decision made by a previous family member can simply be rewritten. That distinction is the pressure point. And according to the story, Louise's lawyers believed they had found evidence showing that Philip had anticipated exactly this kind of problem. There was allegedly a second document. It was not initially sitting in the main inheritance file. It was not the document that first caught attention. It was something far more personal, a handwritten letter. That discovery is where the entire case begins to take on a different character. A legal clause can be argued over. Lawyers can debate wording. Advisors can challenge interpretations. But a handwritten instruction from Philip, if authentic and correctly interpreted, would carry an entirely different emotional force. It could reveal what he was thinking when the formal documents were being prepared. It could explain why certain protections were included. And most importantly, it could answer the question nobody wanted to face. Did Philip actually expect someone to try to change his decision after he was gone? That question is what allegedly pushed the palace into an internal review. The story claims that advisors were reluctant to accept the lawyer's interpretation without further examination. They wanted the estate records checked. They wanted the wording tested. They wanted to establish whether the disputed clause had the effect Louise's lawyers claimed. That reaction is important because it suggests the controversy was not settled by simply producing one piece of paper. The evidence had to survive scrutiny. And while that scrutiny was taking place, Princess Anne allegedly began examining the records herself. Anne's presence matters because she occupies an unusual position within this story. She is not presented as an outside lawyer. She is not Louise's representative. She is a senior member of the family with decades of experience inside the machinery of the monarchy. Her involvement therefore changes the emotional balance. If she had simply dismissed the claim, the matter might have remained a legal argument. Instead, according to the account, Anne noticed that the documentary trail raised questions that could not be brushed aside. The clause was there. The estate records existed. The alleged inheritance arrangement could be traced, and somewhere beyond those records was a letter that could explain why Philip had structured the decision in the first place. That was the moment the story stopped being about whether Lady Louise had discovered something unexpected. It became about who had known. Because if the documents had been sitting inside confidential records for years, someone had access to them, someone could have read them, someone could have understood what they meant. And if Louise's lawyers were now bringing them forward, the most uncomfortable question was no longer what Philip had left. It was why Louise had allegedly been kept from receiving the full benefit of it. That question would soon point toward a person inside the family circle. And once that name emerged, the inheritance dispute would become something much more personal than anyone expected. For now, though, the most important piece of evidence had not yet been placed in front of the family.
Throughout my own cancer journey, I've been profoundly moved by what I can only call the community of care that surrounds every cancer patient. The specialists, the nurses, researchers, and volunteers who work tirelessly to save and improve lives. But I have also learned something that troubles me deeply.
The handwritten letter was still waiting, and if the account is accurate, what Philip allegedly wrote in that letter was about to make the entire inheritance dispute far more dangerous. If this case already makes you believe Louise deserves the truth, do not simply watch in silence. Subscribe and stay with this story, because the next part reveals what was allegedly hidden from her for years, and why the discovery made the royal family far more nervous than the inheritance itself. The first thing the lawyers did was not accuse anyone. They asked for the records. That sounds ordinary until the records allegedly began answering questions nobody at the palace wanted asked. The estate file contained references to Philip's private arrangements, but the crucial material was scattered across supporting papers, financial schedules, and correspondence. The more closely Louise's legal team examined the trail, the harder it became to treat the inheritance as a simple misunderstanding. The carriage collection was only one part of the issue. The private fund raised a separate question about control. According to the accounts surrounding the dispute, the fund had been structured around Philip's intention that Louise should benefit from it personally. The lawyers therefore focused on the wording governing access, ownership, and any authority that could later alter the arrangement. That distinction mattered because royal families operate through several different kinds of property. Some assets belong to the institution. Some are held by trusts or estates. Others can be privately owned. Confusing those categories can turn an inheritance disagreement into a much larger constitutional and financial argument. Louise's lawyers allegedly believe the documents placed Philip's arrangements in the private category. If that interpretation survived scrutiny, later administrative decisions could not simply be treated as though they had erased the original instruction. The next step was to establish the chain of custody. Who prepared the records? Who reviewed them after Philip's death? Who had authority to classify the assets? And who decided that Louise was not to receive what the documents appeared to describe? Those questions forced the investigation away from family opinion and toward dates, signatures, and internal records. The lawyers reportedly found that the disputed material had passed through more than one administrative stage. That mattered because it made the explanation of a simple clerical oversight harder to sustain. An isolated mistake can happen. A series of records carrying the same omission is more difficult to explain. Then the financial records created another complication. The private fund had allegedly been treated differently from ordinary family spending. It was not simply money placed into a general household account. Its documentation pointed toward a designated purpose and beneficiary. That gave Louise's lawyers another basis for arguing that the arrangement had been deliberate. At this point, the palace could still challenge the interpretation. It could argue that Philip's language had been misunderstood. It could question whether the assets had been transferred in the way the lawyers claimed. It could insist that later administrative rules had changed the position. But there was one thing it could not easily change: the original wording. That is why the legal review became so important. The lawyers reportedly requested the full estate record rather than selected pages. They wanted every schedule, amendment, note, and correspondence entry connected to the disputed inheritance. Their objective was simple. They needed to determine whether the clause stood alone or formed part of a broader plan. What they found allegedly suggested the latter. Several references pointed toward Philip having considered the possibility that his private wishes might later be questioned. The wording was careful. It did not read like a casual instruction written without thought. It appeared designed to reduce ambiguity. That changed the central question again. If Philip had anticipated disagreement, who was he protecting Louise from? The answer could not yet be established, but the documents allegedly contained a clue. A reference appeared to another family member who had been involved in handling the relevant paperwork. The name was not presented as proof of wrongdoing, it was simply part of the documentary trail, yet its appearance mattered because it connected the inheritance file to someone who had knowledge of the arrangement. That person would become increasingly important as the investigation moved forward. For Louise, the stakes were also changing. This was no longer simply about receiving valuable property from a grandfather. It concerned whether a private decision made within the family could be recognized after years of uncertainty. It concerned whether records could be trusted, and it raised the uncomfortable possibility that Louise had been operating without information that could have changed her position. The legal team therefore began separating the evidence into three categories. First came the documents that established Philip's original intention. Second came the records showing how the assets had been handled afterward. Third came the evidence concerning the people who had access to those records. That third category was the most sensitive. A document can reveal an instruction. A financial record can reveal what happened afterward. But identifying who knew about the discrepancy can expose responsibility. That was where the investigation began to move from inheritance law into family politics. The palace advisors reportedly wanted an internal legal review before any material was released to Louise's side. Their concern was understandable from an institutional perspective. Once confidential estate documents are released, they cannot easily be pulled back. Once a royal family member publicly asserts a private inheritance right, the dispute can become impossible to contain. But delaying the material carried its own risk. If Louise's lawyers were correct, continued resistance could make the palace appear to be blocking a legitimate inheritance rather than simply checking an uncertain claim. That pressure was building while Princess Anne continued examining the documentation. Her role became particularly significant because she could approach the matter from inside the family rather than through a purely legal lens. She understood the difference between ceremonial assets and private possessions. She also understood how quickly an internal disagreement could become a public problem once documents began circulating. The records allegedly gave her another reason to be cautious. The disputed clause was not the only reference to Louise. There were indications that Philip's instructions had been repeated or reinforced elsewhere. That meant the lawyers might not need to rely on one contested sentence. They could potentially establish a pattern, and a pattern is much harder to dismiss as a mistake. The palace therefore faced a problem with no comfortable answer. If the documents were rejected, the lawyers could challenge that decision and ask why the evidence had been disregarded. If the documents were accepted, the family would have to recognize an inheritance arrangement that had allegedly been denied for years. Either way, the issue was no longer going away. Then came the discovery that changed the legal team's strategy. A reference in the estate papers pointed toward a separate personal communication from Philip. It was not included with the main schedules. It was not part of the material initially reviewed. It was described as private correspondence, and according to the account, it contained Philip's own words rather than language prepared by lawyers or administrators. That distinction was enormous. A formal estate document could be interpreted through legal terminology. A personal letter could reveal the intention behind that terminology. Louise's lawyers now had a reason to demand that communication. The palace advisors had an equally strong reason to examine it before anyone else saw it. The dispute had reached a point where neither side could safely assume the other would back down. And this is where the story became dangerous for the person who had allegedly known about the missing correspondence. Because if that letter confirmed what the lawyers suspected, the question would no longer be whether Philip intended Louise to inherit. The question would be why the evidence had allegedly remained out of sight. The pressure also changed how the family viewed the inheritance itself. Until the documents surfaced, the issue could be kept within the language of administration. After the review began, every decision surrounding Louise could be interpreted as evidence of a larger dispute. That made even routine requests potentially significant. The lawyers reportedly resisted any attempt to reduce the matter to sentiment. They did not need to argue that Louise was owed something simply because Philip loved her. Their position rested on documentation, sequence, and intent. If the paperwork showed a deliberate transfer, then personal feelings were secondary. That approach also explained why the lawyers were unwilling to accept verbal assurances. A promise made in a private room could be denied or carefully forgotten. A signed document could be examined, preserved, and challenged through channels. The deeper problem was that the alleged arrangement reached back to Philip himself. Whatever anyone thought of Louise's position, the dispute could not be separated from the question of what he had intended when he created the arrangement. And now the missing letter had become the key. The file had pointed toward it. The lawyers knew it existed. The palace knew it mattered. But nobody yet knew what Philip had actually written. That uncertainty was about to disappear. If the first discovery made you believe Louise had been denied something that may have been hers, then do not look away now. Stay with this story, because the next part gets worse, and the evidence allegedly points directly toward the person who knew where Philip's final words were hidden. The letter was no longer a rumor buried in an estate file. It had become the one piece of evidence capable of changing the entire balance of the dispute. According to the accounts surrounding the case, Lady Louise's lawyers had now established that the missing correspondence existed, that it was connected to Prince Philip's private instructions, and that someone within the family structure had known about it. The next move was simple. They wanted the letter produced. That request created a problem for the palace. If the letter said what Louise's lawyers believed it said, then the dispute could no longer be explained as confusion over an old inheritance. Philip would have left a direct statement about what should happen to his property, and the statement could potentially challenge the authority later being exercised over those assets. The palace advisors therefore pushed for a deeper legal review. They wanted the letter authenticated. They wanted its date established. They wanted to know who had received it, who had stored it, and why it had not appeared alongside the principal estate documents. Every question led back to the same uncomfortable issue. Why had Louise apparently been left without the benefit of information that could have changed her inheritance position? That was the question her lawyers were preparing to put on record. The legal team did not need to make a public accusation. The documents themselves created the pressure. Their strategy was to reconstruct the chain of events and allow the evidence to show where the original instruction had been separated from the outcome. They began with the date of Philip's instruction. Then they examined the financial records surrounding the private fund. Then they traced references to the carriage collection. Finally, they followed the administrative trail surrounding the person who had handled the confidential material. The pattern allegedly became clearer. Philip's wishes had been recorded. The assets had been identified. Louise had been connected to the arrangement, yet the final position presented to her did not reflect the same intention. That gap was the heart of the dispute. It also explains why the palace could not simply dismiss the lawyers as relatives demanding special treatment. The argument was not based on rank. It was based on whether a previous private instruction had been properly carried through. Princess Anne's involvement now became more consequential. She had reportedly reviewed the records with the same concern that had driven the lawyers. The issue was not whether Louise should receive favorable treatment because she was family. The issue was whether Philip's documented decision still carried meaning after his death. Anne understood the danger of allowing the matter to become a contest of personalities. If Charles supported the palace position, Louise could argue that her grandfather's written wishes were being overridden. If Charles accepted Louise's position, the palace would have to acknowledge that a private arrangement had been mishandled for years. Neither outcome was comfortable. Then the lawyers made their next move. They requested access to the original correspondence rather than a copy or summary. That detail mattered because summaries can leave out wording that changes an interpretation. They wanted the actual letter, the actual handwriting, and the original context. The request reportedly caused hesitation. A copy could be reviewed, a summary could be debated, but the original letter could settle questions that had remained open. And once the original was placed before the family, there would be nowhere left to hide behind uncertainty. That is when the story took its most personal turn. The correspondence allegedly contained more than an instruction about property. It named a family member. The name mattered because this was not someone outside the royal household. The person had allegedly been close enough to the relevant records to understand what Philip intended and influential enough for the material to remain outside the normal inheritance process. That did not automatically prove deliberate concealment, but it raised a question that could not be ignored. If the person knew about Philip's instruction, why had Louise allegedly not received the inheritance described in it? The answer remained disputed. The allegation of concealment had not been independently established in the material surrounding the story, but the possibility was now serious enough to force an internal examination. The legal advisors reportedly began comparing dates, signatures, correspondence logs, and estate entries. Their objective was to determine whether the missing letter had simply been misfiled or whether its absence from the main record had been connected to a deliberate decision. That distinction could determine everything. A mistake would suggest administrative failure. A deliberate omission would suggest something far more serious. And while the review continued, Louise's position became stronger for another reason. Her lawyers were no longer asking the palace to interpret Philip's intentions from memory. They were asking it to confront the documents themselves. That changed the power dynamic. The quieter Louise had remained publicly, the more significant the legal preparation appeared. There was no need for her to make a dramatic accusation in front of cameras. Her representatives could do what public confrontation could not. They could force the institution to answer specific questions about specific records. The palace now had to decide whether to release the letter. That decision was complicated by another concern. If Philip's handwritten words directly limited later interference, the document could have implications beyond Louise. Other private gifts and family arrangements could potentially become subjects of renewed scrutiny. A precedent would be established. If one private instruction had to be respected because it was properly documented, other old instructions might demand the same treatment. That was why the dispute allegedly frightened palace advisors more than the value of the carriage collection or the private fund. The real danger was the precedent. A successful claim by Louise could encourage other members of the family to examine old estate papers more closely. Forgotten letters could suddenly become important. Private gifts could be reconsidered. Previous assumptions about who controlled particular assets could be challenged. One inheritance dispute could therefore become a wider examination of royal records. That possibility made the missing letter even more important. The lawyers reportedly knew that. The palace advisors knew it, and according to the account, Princess Anne understood it as well. She was not prepared to treat Philip's paperwork as something that could be ignored, simply because a later administration found it inconvenient. The atmosphere around the family meeting consequently changed. This was no longer an informal disagreement about money. It was becoming a test of whether written decisions survived the people who made them. And then the letter finally appeared. It was handwritten. It carried Philip's signature. Most importantly, the wording allegedly went directly to the question of authority. The letter stated, according to the account, that the decision concerning Louise was Philip's own and that Charles would not have authority to alter it simply because he later became sovereign. That sentence transformed the dispute. Until that moment, Charles could argue that the palace was reviewing an uncertain historical arrangement. After that moment, the argument became much harder. Philip had allegedly anticipated the possibility of later interference. He had allegedly put his position into his own handwriting. And he had allegedly made clear that the inheritance was not intended to become subject to another person's preference. But the most explosive part of the letter had not yet been discussed. Philip allegedly identified the relative who had helped keep the arrangement from becoming fully visible. That revelation could explain how the inheritance remained disputed for so long. It could also change the relationship between several members of the family. For Louise, the discovery was deeply personal. The issue was no longer simply whether she would receive an inheritance. It was whether people around her had known about her grandfather's wishes while she remained unaware of the full documentation. That is a different kind of betrayal. Money can be measured, property can be valued. A missing truth is harder to repair. And that was precisely why the next family meeting carried so much weight. Louise's lawyers were preparing to put the original letter in front of the people whose decisions could determine what happened next. They were not coming with a request for sympathy. They were coming with a document, and once that document was opened, the name inside it could force the royal family to confront a question that had been avoided for years. The timing made the discovery more damaging. The longer the letter remained outside the record, the harder it became to explain why nobody had brought it forward when the inheritance was first reviewed. The lawyers could now ask a question: who had the document, when did they have it, and what decision followed? There was another reason the letter mattered. Philip was allegedly protecting a member of his family. That intention gave the document weight beyond its financial value. If the wording was authentic, Louise was not challenging an arrangement created after Philip's death. She was relying on a decision he had made while alive and able to state what he wanted. If you believe Louise deserves the truth rather than another year of silence, make your support count by liking, sharing, and subscribing now, because the next part brings the letter into the family meeting, reveals the name inside it, and takes this inheritance dispute somewhere far more serious. The room went quiet when the final page was placed on the table. According to the accounts surrounding the case, Lady Louise's lawyers had arrived with the document that could settle the inheritance dispute. They were no longer asking whether Prince Philip had intended Louise to receive the disputed assets. They were presenting a handwritten statement that allegedly addressed the question directly. King Charles was now facing a problem that could not be solved by administrative language. If the letter was authentic, and if its wording meant what Louise's lawyers claimed, then the argument over the carriage collection and private fund had moved beyond family preference. It had become a question of whether Philip's private decision could be changed after his death. The timing made the meeting even more tense. For years, Louise had remained one of the quieter members of the royal family. She had not built her public identity around disputes over titles, money, or palace privileges. That made the legal confrontation unusual. She was not demanding attention. Her lawyers were demanding an answer, and they had brought evidence. The first document was the estate clause. The second was the financial record connected to the private fund. The third was the material concerning Philip's carriage collection. Then came the handwritten letter. According to the story, Philip's wording was unusually direct. He allegedly made clear that the assets were intended for Louise, and that the arrangement was not to be altered simply because another family member later occupied the throne. That sentence struck at the center of the dispute. Charles could still question the legal interpretation. His advisors could examine the circumstances under which Philip wrote it. They could ask whether the letter had been properly incorporated into the estate arrangement, but they could not pretend the words did not exist. Princess Anne was reportedly watching the proceedings closely. Her concern was not presented as blind loyalty toward Louise. It was more fundamental. If Philip had signed a private instruction, and that instruction had been preserved, then the family needed a clear reason before disregarding it. Anne understood the institutional danger. The monarchy depends heavily on continuity. Decisions made by one sovereign become part of the record inherited by the next. If every new reign can simply rewrite private decisions made by the previous generation, then old agreements become uncertain. That was the argument emerging inside the room. The lawyers reportedly pressed the point without raising their voices. They asked for the exact basis on which Charles could override Philip's instruction. They wanted the palace advisors to identify the legal authority supporting that position. No one could answer with a simple sentence. That hesitation mattered. It suggested that the issue was not as straightforward as some had assumed. Then Louise's legal team produced the part of the letter that allegedly named another relative. The name changed the atmosphere immediately. The person identified was reportedly someone who had access to the relevant records and knowledge of the inheritance arrangement. The account does not independently establish that this person deliberately concealed the documents. But the allegation was serious enough to explain why the lawyers wanted the family to examine the entire history of the file. The question was now simple. If this relative knew about Philip's instructions, why had Louise allegedly been left without the full benefit of them? There were several possible explanations. The material could have been misunderstood. The documents could have been mishandled. The person could have believed the arrangement was not legally effective. Or, as the more damaging allegation suggested, the information could have been deliberately kept from Louise. The lawyers did not need to choose an explanation immediately. Their job was to force the evidence into the open. That made the named relative vulnerable to scrutiny. Every earlier decision could now be reconsidered. Every missing page could become relevant. Every administrative note could be compared against the date of Philip's instruction. The family meeting therefore stopped being about one inheritance. It became an examination of what happened after Philip made his decision. And that was when the emotional weight of the dispute became impossible to ignore. Louise was not simply being offered an inheritance from a distant estate. The assets were allegedly connected to her grandfather's personal interests and his desire to leave something directly to her. The carriage collection carried his personality. The private fund represented financial protection. Together, They suggested a deliberate attempt to provide Louise with something that belonged to her independently of the wider machinery of the monarchy. That independence was precisely what made the dispute so sensitive. If the assets were genuinely private, then the institution had less room to treat them as ordinary royal resources. If Philip had specifically protected Louise's ownership, the case became even stronger. And if he had anticipated interference, the handwritten letter became the key to understanding the entire arrangement. The palace advisors therefore had to examine the letter line by line. They reportedly checked the handwriting, the date, the signature, and the surrounding correspondence. They also had to determine whether the letter was merely an expression of Philip's wishes or part of a legally effective arrangement. That distinction could decide the outcome. A personal wish can carry enormous emotional weight without necessarily changing legal ownership. A properly executed estate instruction can do much more. Louise's lawyers understood that difference. That is why they reportedly continued to rely on the wider documentary record rather than presenting the letter as a magic solution. The letter supported the clause. The financial records supported the fund. The estate documentation supported the existence of the arrangement. The pieces were being assembled into one argument. Then Charles faced the question he had been trying to avoid. Would he challenge the documents or accept them? A challenge could prolong the dispute and risk making the palace appear hostile to Philip's recorded wishes. Acceptance could mean acknowledging that Louise had a stronger claim than previously recognized. Neither option was politically comfortable. The family implications were just as serious. Prince Edward and Sophie would have to watch as their daughter's inheritance became the center of a dispute involving the king. Anne would have to decide how far she was prepared to go in defending the principle behind the documents, and the relative named in Philip's letter now faced the possibility that years of private decisions could be examined in detail. This was the moment when the story allegedly shifted from a legal review into a family confrontation. The lawyers had brought the evidence, the palace had the opportunity to respond, and Louise's position was no longer based on a missing piece of paperwork. It rested on a chain of documents that allegedly pointed in the same direction. There was one final issue that made the confrontation even more serious. Philip's alleged wording concerning Charles was not simply about Louise receiving property. It reportedly addressed the limits of later interference. That meant the letter could be interpreted as Philip deliberately separating his private decision from the authority of the future sovereign. If that interpretation held, Charles could not simply rely on the fact that he was king. He would have to identify a legal basis for changing a private arrangement created before he inherited the crown. That was a much harder question. The lawyers reportedly left the issue hanging in the room. They did not need to accuse Charles of acting unlawfully. They only needed him to explain why Philip's documented instruction should not stand. The silence that followed allegedly became the most revealing moment of the meeting, because the argument had finally reached its foundation. This was no longer about whether Lady Louise was being favored. It was about whether Prince Philip's final decisions still meant something after he was gone. And that question could not be answered with tradition, family hierarchy, or public image. It required the documents. The review continued late into the discussion, with advisors comparing the letter against the original estate records. The more closely they examined the material, the harder it became to separate the inheritance from Philip's broader intention. Then came the point nobody in the room could ignore. The documents appeared to reinforce one another. The clause identified Louise. The financial records supported the existence of the fund. The estate material connected her to the disputed assets, and the letter allegedly explained why Philip had wanted the arrangement protected. At that moment, the burden shifted. Louise's lawyers no longer had to prove that Philip had feelings for his granddaughter. They had to show that he had made a decision. According to the story, they believed they had done exactly that. But the meeting was not over. There was still the matter of the relative named in the letter. And there was still the question of what Charles would do after seeing his father's alleged final instruction in his own handwriting. The answer would determine whether the royal family accepted Louise's inheritance or prepared for an even bigger legal battle. So if the documents already make you believe Louise should not have had to fight for what Philip allegedly left her, do not scroll away now. Like, share, and subscribe. because the next part is where the family learns exactly what Philip's decision could mean for everyone else. The decision was no longer hidden inside a file. By the end of the family confrontation, the dispute had reached the point where someone had to decide whether Prince Philip's alleged instructions would be respected. Lady Louise's lawyers had presented the evidence they believed established her claim. The palace had reviewed the material, and the question facing the family was no longer whether the story sounded convincing, it was whether the documents could be ignored. According to the accounts surrounding this case, the answer was increasingly difficult to defend. The estate clause remained in place. The financial records remained in place, the disputed carriage collection remained connected to the inheritance argument, and the handwritten letter allegedly gave the documents something they had previously lacked: Philip's own explanation of what he wanted. That changed the final stage of the review. Instead of asking whether Louise had been promised something informally, advisors had to examine whether Philip had created a private arrangement that survived his death. The distinction was critical. A promise could be questioned. A properly documented inheritance instruction demanded a much more serious response. Charles therefore faced a choice that carried consequences either way. He could reject the lawyer's interpretation and continue challenging the inheritance. That would keep the dispute alive and could lead to further examination of the estate records. Or he could accept that Philip's decision had to stand. The second option was difficult for another reason. Accepting Louise's claim would mean recognizing that the earlier understanding of her inheritance had been incomplete. It would also mean acknowledging that a private decision made by Philip could not simply be replaced by a later preference. That was the point at which the alleged dispute became larger than Lady Louise. It touched the principle behind private inheritance inside a royal family. The palace could reorganize institutional matters. It could review budgets. It could examine official responsibilities. But private property raised a different question. If a previous family member had deliberately assigned an asset to an individual, what authority existed to reverse that decision without a clear legal basis? That was the question the lawyers had forced into the open. The review reportedly continued through the supporting records. Advisors compared the wording of the estate clause with the financial documentation and the letter attributed to Philip. They examined whether the documents were consistent with one another. According to the story, they were. That consistency mattered. The carriage collection was not standing alone. The private fund was not standing alone. The handwritten letter was not standing alone. Each piece allegedly reinforced the same basic position. Philip had intended Louise to receive something privately, and the later handling of the arrangement had not reflected that intention. That was the point where the legal argument became much harder to dismiss as confusion. The remaining dispute concerned the person named in the letter. The account alleges that this relative had known about the arrangement and had played a role in keeping the information from becoming fully visible. That remains an allegation within the story, not an established finding. But the mere appearance of the name was enough to create a new problem for the family. If the person had acted deliberately, there would be questions of motive. If the person had acted because of a legal misunderstanding, there would be questions of judgment. If the material had simply been mishandled, there would be questions about the palace's record-keeping. Every explanation carried consequences. And Louise's lawyers had one advantage. They could keep returning to the same thing, the documents. They did not need to win an argument about personalities. They did not need to convince the public that one royal was good and another was bad. They needed the estate records to support their interpretation. That approach made the dispute more difficult to control. The story also placed emotional pressure on the family because Louise had never been one of the royals most associated with public confrontation. She had largely remained away from the loudest disputes surrounding the institution. Now her name was attached to a question involving her grandfather's legacy and the authority of the king. For Prince Edward and Sophie, the issue could therefore not be treated as an abstract legal matter. It concerned their daughter and the intentions of a man who had been central to their family. For Anne, the issue concerned continuity. For Charles, it concerned authority. For Louise, it concerned recognition. Those interests were different, but they collided around the same documents. And then came the decision. According to the account, the palace ultimately accepted the position that Louise's lawyers had been advancing. The disputed inheritance was to be recognized according to Philip's recorded intention, with the carriage collection and private fund treated as assets intended for Louise rather than resources available for later reassignment. That was the moment the title of this story took on its full meaning. Lady Louise had not simply received an unexpected inheritance. Her lawyers had allegedly confirmed that she was entitled to what Philip had already intended her to have, despite years in which that position had not been recognized in the way she and her representatives believed it should have been. The significance was not only financial, it was personal. Philip's legacy had survived the dispute, his alleged decision had survived the passage of time, and the documents had forced the family to confront a choice that could no longer be postponed. But the conclusion did not erase what had happened before. If the account is correct, Louise had spent years without the full recognition of an arrangement her grandfather had allegedly created for her. Even if the final decision restored her position, it could not return those years. That is where the story becomes less about property and more about trust. A family can repair a financial mistake. It is harder to repair the suspicion that someone knew the truth and chose not to reveal it. The relative named in Philip's letter therefore remains one of the most troubling elements of the account. Until the underlying evidence is independently established, the identity and motives surrounding that person should remain treated as disputed. But the larger question remains: why was the arrangement not openly recognized from the beginning? Was it administrative confusion? Was the legal position misunderstood? Or did someone believe that Philip's decision could be quietly set aside once the circumstances changed? Those questions may never be answered publicly. What can be understood from the story is the importance of documentation. Royal families may operate through ceremony, tradition, and hierarchy, but private inheritance ultimately depends on what was actually decided and what evidence survives. A signature can outlive a reign. A letter can outlive an argument. A forgotten clause can remain dormant for years and still become important when someone finally reads it carefully. That is the lesson at the center of Lady Louise's alleged inheritance dispute. The most powerful person in a room is not always the person with the title. Sometimes it is the person holding the document that everyone else was hoping would never be produced. If the alleged decision is accepted, it becomes a reminder that private royal arrangements cannot automatically be treated as disposable simply because the institution changes around them. It also shows why old family records can carry enormous power. Today, the dispute may appear to be about a carriage collection and a private fund. That possibility is what gives this story its final tension. Because if one overlooked clause could challenge years of assumptions, what else could still be sitting inside the private archives? Those questions remain unanswered. For Lady Louise, however, the immediate issue is clearer. According to the story, her lawyers forced the inheritance question into the open, produced evidence connecting her to Philip's alleged wishes, and pushed the palace toward recognition of a claim that had remained disputed for years. The granddaughter who had rarely occupied the center of royal controversy suddenly became the focus of a battle over inheritance, authority, and memory. The fight was not won through a public confrontation. It was not won through a dramatic speech. It was won, according to the account, through preparation, records, and a letter that allegedly preserved what Philip wanted long after he could no longer defend it himself. That is what makes the story so difficult to dismiss emotionally. If Philip really did intend those assets for Louise, then the most important thing he left behind was not the money or the carriages. It was the evidence of his decision. And if the evidence had remained buried, the inheritance might have remained a question forever. Instead, someone opened the file. Someone noticed the discrepancy, and once the documents were placed in front of the family, the old assumption could no longer stand untouched. The story therefore ends where it began, with a question of ownership. Not who is most powerful, not who is closest to the throne, not who can issue the next instruction, but who had already been chosen by the person who owned the decision in the first place. For everyone watching, the central issue was simple: whether Philip's wishes mattered once he was gone completely forever. If you believe a person should not have to fight the institution for what was allegedly left to her, then do not let this story disappear quietly. Like this video, share it with someone who follows the royal family, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Your support is the simplest way to stand with the demand for transparency, instead of standing by while important questions are pushed back into silence. And stay with this channel, because the next royal story is about to get even worse, even more revealing, and far harder to explain.